Mr. Ovid Vitas. Come along over.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome Jason Byrne to today's presentation, which is hosted by the History Group of the University Club of Winter Park. We are excited to introduce a speaker whose passion for uncovering the hidden corners of Florida's past brings history vividly to life. Our guest today, Jason Byrne, is a software executive by day, but by night he transforms into a dedicated historian and a community leader. As president of the Longwood Historic Society since 2017, Jason has revitalized the organization through initiatives like the Monster-5K fundraiser, engaging walking tours, and the creation of the Society's award-winning website, historiclongwood.com. His deep contributions to the community were recognized by the City of Longwood, which honored him with the Martin Luther King Jr. Good Citizen Award. And also, Jason also reaches thousands of history enthusiasts across Florida, Central Florida mostly, through his popular blog, floridahistoryblog.com. He is a graduate of Florida Southern College and holds a degree in journalism with a minor in history. An ideal combination for someone who brings storytelling and research together so effectively. In today's talk, titled Booze and Bolita, Organized Crime in Central Florida, Jason will guide us through the dark and fascinating world of Harlan Blackburn, a local mafia boss whose empire of illegal liquor, drugs, gambling, and murder left an indelible mark on the region. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jason Byrne.
Thank you all very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here today to speak with you. Most of this was already done for me, so I appreciate the great introduction, but I've been a Central Florida native my entire life. I was raised a couple hours south of here in Sebring, Florida, and my wife, Melinda, who's here with me this morning, we met at Florida Southern College, and she pulled me to Seminole County back about almost 25 years ago now, so I kind of consider this my second hometown here. As mentioned, I do have several places you can contact me. Feel free to take a picture of this if you want to, but I run some Facebook groups online that post a lot of history too, and invite you to join us with the Longwood Historic Society in any of our events or becoming a member, so historiclongwood.com. All right, today we're going to talk about organized crime in Booze and Bolita, and this is kind of the three or four different sections that I'm going to break it up today. I'm going to first start talking about just the general business, what was the booze racket and what was Bolita, and then we're going to kind of take a walk down I-4. We're going to start over in Tampa, and we're going to head down toward our area and just talk about how the different powers that be led the underworld in that region. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about corruption, because none of the organized crimes reign would have been possible without the complicit nature of our law enforcement officers and our political leaders at that time. So that's a very interesting element of that. All right, let's talk about booze. Everybody likes to talk about booze, right? When I first started researching this, I was initially a little bit ignorant, a little bit confused, because I was like, Prohibition wasn't a very long period of time. So how was it that illegal liquor was so prolific and drove so much of the mafia's power for so long, if really we're only talking about 13 years? And what I found out was that it really extended before and after Prohibition. So let's talk a little bit about that. So everybody knows about moonshine. So moonshine was produced in every corner of the woods all across, especially the South, but throughout the United States. I found fascinating articles in my research of just every little bush you would find. You'd see a schoolhouse in Chuliota, and behind it they would discover a still right in the bush right behind the schoolhouse. And you see one of the pictures here, they're actually distilling in a drum labeled oil. I'm not sure how safe I would really feel drinking out of what once contained oil, but they made it work. Outside of moonshine, one thing I wasn't really aware of was red whiskey. And beyond just the nature of like producing alcohol when it was illegal during Prohibition, the other reason they produced both moonshine and red whiskey was because of the tax burden around alcohol. And as you see here at the top, for $120 worth of whiskey, $70 of that was tax, right? So the majority of that money is going right to the government, and whenever that kind of markup is there, there's a temptation to try to get around it. So that was actually a major driving force behind both moonshine and red whiskey, was getting around the taxes. So what is red whiskey? Red whiskey is actually legally, officially manufactured booze that was sold under the table. So it wasn't so it was a lot more, less likely to kill you, shall we say. So it was the same liquor you would buy legitimately, but sold the back of the house or sold by somebody without a liquor license. And that way, that $120 worth of whiskey they could sell for $50 and make a healthy margin doing it. And they didn't have to pay, on top of that, they didn't have to pay the liquor license if they were some of those establishments. So again, interesting to realize that it wasn't just the outlawed nature, but the profit margin nature of it. And beyond the national prohibition, there was also local prohibition. So one of the really fascinating court cases that I found in my research was that when Seminole County split from Orange County in 1913, there was a big question: is Seminole County wet or dry? Now, Orange County had already had prohibition, so Orange County was dry. You could not sell liquor anywhere in Orange County. And Seminole County originally was part of Orange County. So in 1913, when there was the split, a lot of people said, okay, well now Seminole County split from Orange County. There is no law in the books in Seminole County that we can't sell liquor. So open season, right? We can sell liquor. We can sell liquor in Seminole County now that we're a separate county. So this went all the way to court, though, and the court decided that that was not the case because Seminole County split from dry Orange County, that Seminole County was born dry. So in 1913, and all the way through Prohibition, of course, liquor sales was illegal in Seminole County as well. So after Prohibition, though, everybody had their fill, and everybody in this area at least had their fill of being told they couldn't drink liquor. And so they had mandates on the books in these counties to overturn these local, pretty much every county in the state had a vote, should we go wet or be dry? Well, Seminole County, you see, they were really ready. They were 3-1 in favor of allowing alcohol. Orange County was pretty convinced as well. They were 2-1. But in a lot of counties, especially in the rural areas, a little bit further outlying, like Polk County, Highlands County, Hardy County, they were not ready for this. So beyond Prohibition, it remained illegal in a lot of these counties, all the way through many times the 50s, even the 80s. And there's a few examples up in the Panhandle that even today, there are some counties there's one county actually that's still a dry county in Florida today. So Prohibition was not just the 20s through 1933, it was locally much wider than that. So that gave the mafia plenty of room to sell illegal liquor. And beyond just the wet and dry, there was also the concept of damp counties where they had, it wasn't totally illegal, wasn't totally legal, but they might limit what kinds of alcohol could be sold, maybe no liquor, only beer, maybe on certain days. So we had these blue laws across the state as well. So the mafia had a kind of field day, always getting around whatever law they put in place. So here's a little meme I found that I thought was really interesting because a lot of the establishments where this illegal liquor was sold were legitimate in the front of the house. They were clubs, they were stores, they were bars, and they did a legitimate business. But in the back of the house is where you found the not so legit things going on. That's where you found the under the table liquor. That's where you found the gambling halls. And those places became the seats of power for these organized crime. And they also probably a pretty convenient way to launder money, right? If you have a legit front of the house and dirty back of the house, you could kind of filter that money through it as well. So one of the interesting things that you find is that because of those local laws that I was just talking about, where, this is Polk County, for example. Polk County was one of the holdouts that made alcohol sales illegal for the longest period of time. And so what you would have is, as soon as you cross the Polk County border, on either side, you would have one of these establishments. So the red line here is actually not I-4. This predates I-4. This is the old Tampa Highway that meanders from Kissimmee toward Tampa. And on the Osceola County side, you see the Palms. And on the Hillsborough County side of that line, you see the Paramount Club. And so these were the two places that if you wanted to drink in Polk County, you just crossed the line, and it was perfectly legal. These were also the two places where organized crime headquartered their operations in the area. A little bit more locally, as I mentioned, it wasn't just county by county, but also cities had cracked down. Altamont Springs had a little bit more oppressive laws around when alcohol could be sold. And so just outside the city limits of Altamont Springs, you would find Club 436 on the 1792 side, and you would find the Seminole Club down south, kind of on the Maitland side of Altamont Springs. And those, again, in Seminole County became the seats of those operations. This is a picture here of Club 436. The building's actually still there. It's boarded up now, but it's still there near Anchor Road and 436 in Altamont. And I didn't mention the Two Spot, but Two Spot was a popular place up near Stanford, east of Stanford in Midway. And the Seminole Club, which was the place I mentioned that was on the Maitland side of Altamont Springs, I pinpointed the site of where the Seminole Club once was, and ironically, it is now a church. It is where St. Mary Magdalene, major Catholic church there, was the spot of these illicit activities going on up through the 60s. So that was an interesting find there. And in Orlando, actually, I was just talking to somebody about a book that was just recently published by Joy Dickinson about the Flamingo Club. This was the hot spot in Orlando. It was on Highway 50 on the east side of town. And it had a renowned cook selling great Cuban food. They had great performances of nationally renowned, concerts, opera singers and bands. But in the back of the house, again, is where the not so legitimate business went down. And we'll talk more about some of the folks who operated out of the Flamingo Club later. All right, now let's move on to Bolita. Okay, so the other major driver in the financial success of these organizations in Central Florida during this period was a little game called Bolita, which literally means little ball in Spanish. So Bolita became popular in the Cuban communities initially in the 1880s and then even more so in the 1890s. But then it gradually spread out from there. And one of the really appealing things about Bolita for folks was that Bolita could be done with very small bets. As little as a penny or a nickel, you could have some significant winnings. And so it appealed to the working class folks of the era. So it spread out from the Cuban community to the other immigrant communities to the poor communities, and eventually became a universal game that was beloved by everybody, really. So the way it worked is you had a set of balls. They probably weren't red like this, but you had a set of balls with numbers 1 to 100. And you would pick a number, and it's a really simple game to play. So you just pick a number 1 through 100, and if your number hit, whatever your bet was, you would get, depending on who was the operator of the game, anywhere from a 60 times payout to a 90 times payout. Pretty good deal, right? It was also a good deal for the operator because your odds were actually 100 to 1, but still, it was a fun game to play. This became so prolific in the community, it almost became part of their culture identity. So when you're around, almost like water cooler talk, people would be talking about numbers, and they got into this almost science of picking numbers. Like if you see a black cat, that means this, and they literally had books. If you have a dream about this, it means this, and so they would interpret what numbers they should play And again, it was what you did for conversation beyond just the mere fact of winning or losing. So initially, Bolita was not run by balls like this locally as much, but it was actually run out of the Cuban lottery. So the Cuban government sanctioned a lottery in 1909, and that became the de facto number source at first. And so they would listen on a little radio at Saturday at 2 p.m. It would come out. They would lock bets at, say, 11 in the morning on Saturday. They listen for the numbers, and that's how they'd get the numbers. And then you know, that once a week wasn't enough, so they got creative and found more and more number sources. The problem with that was that every once in a while, the house would lose. There were certain numbers that were really popular, let's say 13, or, you know, 1. And when those numbers would hit, it wasn't like a pool of money that got like split. You got paid out like 70-1, right? So if one of those popular numbers hit, those bosses could be out a whole lot of money. They didn't really like that. They wanted to make sure the odds were in their favor, right? And so not only that, but they wanted to have more regular games that they could control. So what they developed is House Bolita. And so House Bolita was that the local boss would throw their own game, and they would do this sometimes daily, sometimes twice a day. They'd have a day house and night house. And so they would have, again, a bag like this. It wasn't a bag like this. It wasn't a clear plastic. It was a bag, like a canvas type bag. And so they'd make a whole show of the drawing of the numbers. They toss it around the room so the numbers get good and mixed up. And they grab the number, and then they would dramatically dump all the rest of the numbers on the ground, and the one number that they were holding in their hand was the winning number. So you're probably asking yourself, well, Jason, that still seems pretty random, right? Couldn't a hot number still hit? Not exactly. Because what they found out is that they could, by a few different means, they could control which number was pulled. One popular method was throwing the cold numbers. So the cold numbers were the ones that weren't played very often. The hot numbers were the 13s that were played often. The cold numbers were the 87, right, that not a lot of people played. They would literally throw those cold numbers into the freezer. So when they would toss the bag around and they grabbed the ball, the person would grab the literal cold ball, and they would ensure that they had the not a big payout to make. The other method that they'd often use is they could hollow out certain balls, and they could fill with lead other balls. So the heavier balls would go to the bottom, the lighter balls would go to the top, again controlling the randomness in their favor. So the thing about Bolita too that you have to understand was this was not a backroom business. This was commonplace. This was everywhere. I talked to a lot of people in my research one guy said he was a kid working at the grocery store, you know, a bag man, not a bag man, because that's something I'll talk about later. It's actually a name of a title in the Bolita, but he was a bag boy at a grocery store, and they say the ticket man would show up, oh, ticket man's here, and everybody would place their bets. Or there was a barber shop, and everybody knew you could go in the barber shop and place their bets. This was out in the open. Some people would put the winning numbers out on a sign out in front. I heard rumors that even the newspaper would publish kind of a number on some sort of page, and you knew that was the number that was put on Bolita. So this was a very ill-kept secret. And it was a lot of money. And so you see down here, if you adjust for inflation, just Bolita was a multi-billion-dollar business here in Florida. And that's not even counting the business they did for booze and for other types of gambling and extortion, et cetera. So the mafia had a lot of money at their disposal. And I won't go through all the details of these, but this kind of works through the different positions within the Bolita operation, from kind of the smallest person on the totem pole at the top down to the biggest on the bottom. And so it was a very complicated operation, which meant that they would split up the Bolita tickets from the money. They were never in the same place at the same time. So if you found the person, it would be like, I just got these pieces of paper with numbers on them. That doesn't mean anything. And you found the guy with cash. Okay, I just have money. So they would make sure that it was very difficult to pin the crime on them, not to mention the fact that they had the politicians in their back pocket anyway. All right, so now let's talk about some of the players. So as I mentioned earlier, it started with the Cuban community was the one who really brought Bolita into Florida, and therefore Ybor City is a natural place to start if any of you guys know the Tampa area and know Ybor City. And if you've ever eaten at the Columbia restaurant in Ybor City, just know that you've sat in maybe at the same table that some of these folks I'm going to talk about once sat at. This was a common place of business for them to not only eat but discuss their next moves. So one of the first big boss in the underworld in Tampa was not a Cuban, but Charlie Wall. Now, Charlie Wall is a very interesting character because he came from absolute Tampa Bay royalty. If you ever heard of McKay Bay, if you ever heard of the Likes brothers, those were all part of his family lineage. The Walls, the McKays, and the Likes were the wealthy controllers of power. They were some of the first mayors of Tampa, and he was from that family. He was kind of the black sheep of the family. He was always a little bit rebellious. But he still came with all the connections that family gave him. So therefore, he could get into circles that other people in the underworld could not get into, right? He could run with these politicians. He could get the wealthy people to back him. But he also was a man of the people. And he was famous for tossing gold coins full of bags of gold coins, on like the doorsteps of orphanages to give them money. When the cigar workers went on strike in Ybor City, he ran a soup kitchen for an entire year to help support their strike. So he was loved by the rich and by the poor, and that got him into the seat of power from the teens all the way through about 1940. He was very flashy. They called him the White Shadow, and he was pretty flagrant about what he did. But he operated with impunity. And one of the reasons is he put pretty much all the politicians into power. They said there was not an election for about 30 years in Tampa that Charlie Wall did not control. And if you crossed him, you'd probably wind up dead too. So he also, while he was a nice guy, he also wasn't afraid to flex the power with violence. So he loved the spotlight. He would be very flashy. But in the end, that probably is what was his undoing as well. Because during the 30s, and especially around 1940, the Sicilian mafia started to come into power in Tampa. This is the Cosa Nostra that we all think about from New York. Well, those same kind of folks came into Tampa, and they started taking over, and they started eating away at Charlie Wall's business. The most notorious of those is Santo Trafficante Sr., and essentially he consolidated all these kind of subgroups that were kind of rivals to Charlie but were smaller groups. He consolidated all that power until he actually became the most powerful mobster in Tampa. And he had a proposition for Charlie Wall. He gave him an offer that he could not refuse. And that offer was, Charlie, you're going to retire now, and your life will be spared. And Charlie saw the writing on the wall. He was getting a little older, and he just saw the dynamic shifting. So he did not argue with Santo Trafficante Sr. So Charlie Wall effectively retired himself, and it was Santos City from that point on. So starting about 1940, all throughout the 40s, it was Santo Trafficante Sr. without question. Now, Santo was not as flashy as Charlie Wall. He liked to keep a low demeanor. He liked to keep out of the spotlight, let other people do his dirty work for him. He also made most of his money in Cuba. Back when the Cuban market to Tampa was very open and Batista was in power, he had a lot of legitimate casinos that operated in Havana and made a fortune there. Unfortunately for him, his health started to decline around 1950. But he had a protege. His protege was his son. Santo Trafficante Jr. began to slowly take the reins from his father as his health failed. Now, Trafficante Jr. was not as careful as Sr. He was more ambitious than Sr. And he wanted to expand that power well beyond just the Tampa area. He is really the one who started to get their close connection with the organized mob in New York. He was at the famous Mafia Summit in 1957, and And he also was used by the CIA as an asset. And this was confirmed with papers that were released in the 90s that were unclassified. The CIA tried to get him in a plot to murder Castro. He's also quite credibly rumored that he could have been involved in the JFK assassination as well. So this guy was brazen, but he was also very good at what he did, because other than being arrested by Castro once and spending a little bit of time in jail, that was the only time in his entire life he ever spent any time in jail. Santo Trafficante Jr. So I mentioned earlier that Charlie Wall retired because he had an agreement with Santo Trafficante Sr., right? Trafficante Sr. said, "I will protect you, you will be spared, you're fine as long as I'm alive." Well, when Sr. died in 1954, Trafficante Jr. said, "I didn't make that oath with you," right? And Charlie Wall had not retired quietly, let's say. He still was very loud and outspoken. He testified at a hearing with the governor, and he just went around kind of talking trash all the time. So as soon as Sr. had passed away in 1954, Mr. Wall met his untimely end. It was never solved, but, you know. But Charlie Wall was not the only murder in Tampa during that period. This is not a complete list, but they called it the era of blood, and there was just a lot of murders. It was very much what you think about the gang wars in New York were happening on the streets of Tampa during that time period. All right, now let's move on down I-4. We're going to talk about, we're going to start with Polk County, and then we'll talk about Orange County. For the most part, in the early days, from the 30s and the 40s, there was big money in Tampa, there was big money in Cuba. The Trafficantes really didn't care that much about Central Florida. So what happened in Central Florida was these kind of regional bosses cropped up. And one of the first one was Rhodes Boynton. Now I mentioned the Paramount Club in Lakeland earlier. That was Rhodes' main seat of power for a certain time period until it later became the Flamingo Club in Orlando. But he wasn't affiliated with them, but they didn't really care. That was like the rural Florida backcountry. People didn't care. They didn't care at that time. So he came up into power in, like I said, the 30s and the 40s. Now he was run out of Lakeland basically around 1940. There was a murder of a guy named Henry Hull. Boynton was strongly suspected of being involved. They never proved it, but that's when he kind of shifted his operations toward the Orlando side. The heat got too much there in Tampa. One estimate I found, though, was that the Bolita business in Lakeland alone was $3 million a year. And if you adjust that for inflation, that's $68 million in revenue in just Lakeland Bolita. So you extrapolate that across all of Central Florida, this guy was doing big money. Now, he died at just 54 years old. That sounds suspicious, or 44 years old rather, that's my age. I found no evidence to suggest that he was murdered, but very, very young death of Rhodes Boynton. The guy that came up under him, his name was Ed Milan. He had been Boynton's lieutenant for many years. He started out life as a boxer, found these really interesting articles from the late 20s, when he fought around the Florida area and was a really popular boxer. And through those boxing rackets and getting involved in the gambling there, he found his way into organized crime. He started out getting as just a runner for Bolita and gradually worked out to become Rhodes Boynton's lieutenant. Very famously in those mafia circles is that Ed Milan actually saved Rhodes Boynton's behind when he failed to properly rig the Bolita and the number 13 fell. Milan actually had acquired sufficient money to be the one who bailed out Boynton. So that really cemented the loyalty of Boynton had for Ed Milan. So when Boynton passed away, Ed Milan became the new boss in Central Florida. The problem that Ed Milan had was he did not care what the Trafficantes had to say. Okay, so for one, he refused to make any kind of alliances with them. For 2, they asked him to stay out of Polk County because they wanted to expand their operations this way. He said no. And for 3, well, there's actually 2 more. He had testified in court in a bribery case against the sheriff of Polk County. And as he was taking down the sheriff, but in doing so, he also told a lot of the trade secrets, shall we say. And they did not take too kindly to that. The nail in the coffin for Ed Malam was that the Traficantes wanted to do 60 or 70 to 1 payouts. They wanted to do a lower payout if your number hit. But Ed Malam wanted the business, so he gave better odds. He gave 80 to 1, and they weren't too happy with him. So in the night of May 11, 1957, Ed Malam got a call. He got off the phone, and he was a little bit distraught. His wife said, "What's going on?" He said, "Don't worry about it. I'll be home in a couple hours. I got to go do something." Well, he was never seen again, at least not alive. His wife started a search, and it took the whole week until finally he was stumbled upon down in the swamps. There was actually a former army man who was with his wife, and they were hunting swamp cabbage, and they came across the body there that turned out to be Ed Malam. It has never been solved. There's strong suspicion, of course, that the Traficantes or Harlan Blackburn, who we'll talk about next, were involved, but it was never proven. But Ed Malam's reign only lasted for about 4 years. One interesting side note before I move on is I was actually contacted by Ed Malam's family after writing this article. And they said they had always heard the legends, but they had never really put it all together. So that was really fascinating that, the family's still alive, not involved in organized crime anymore, but had become a legend of the family that was kind of always unconfirmed. Okay, so once Ed Malam was out of the way, it was purely Harlan Blackburn who ran Central Florida. Many of you in this room may have heard of Harlan Blackburn, aka the Colonel. His reign of power lasted from the 50s through definitely the 70s and to some extent even into the 80s. Now Harlan started his life of crime very early. Found this newspaper article you see here. When he was 16 years old, he was arrested for forging checks. So this guy, he fast-tracked his criminal empire from a very young age. The very smart thing that Harlan Blackburn did in the 50s, unlike Ed Malam, was that he kissed the ring of Santo Traficante. And so those two guys became aligned, and going back to Ed Malam's murder, it's widely suspected that that was a hit in order to put Harlan in power in Central Florida. So this is a picture of Harlan here at a table. He actually had, I mentioned he and Traficante were friends. They actually had twin rings that matched. They were diamond rings, and it was said that those rings were made from the 2 earrings of Traficante's mother after she passed away. They each had a ring. So that was how close the relationship was between Harlan Blackburn and Traficante Jr. Unlike Traficante Jr., who I mentioned earlier, only spent time in jail one time in Cuba and never again the rest of his life, Harlan Blackburn was in and out of prison all the time. Now, he always found some way to get out of it, or got out on bond, or got the charges dismissed, but he spent a lot of time in prison. He was constantly on trial. Basically, for 30 years, he was on trial nonstop. Harlan Blackburn's compound was actually not too far from here. It was in Castleberry, on Howell Branch Road, near Howell Branch Road, and on Lake Ann, if you know the area, just south of Lake Howell. And they often called Harlan's clan the Cracker Mob. So they were kind of a sub family of the Traficantes crew in Tampa, the Cracker Mob. So in my research, one of the things I did is I sat down with one of the sheriffs from back in the 70s who was involved in investigating Harlan Blackburn. And I made the mistake during that conversation of calling Bolita and calling Harlan's business a victimless crime. He quickly corrected me and lectured me that it was not a victimless crime. And my theory went that, Bolita was effectively the lottery right? And all of a sudden, it was illegal until the state decided it was in their best interest to sanction it, and all of a sudden it's legal, and we can all buy lottery tickets legally. And it's like, so it was kind of it was a crime, but it wasn't a crime. But he quickly reminded me that no, Harlan was a bad dude who had a lot of people killed. He was involved in drugs, he was involved in murders, involved in intimidation, and he was also a sexual deviant. Like, sometimes we make heroes out of these mob figures, but Harlan, at least himself, took advantage of his power with underage girls, I should say. And the police officer told me that he knows this for a fact because he found a stack of Polaroids, and when he was interviewing Harlan, he effectively was, for drama, was like throwing them down on a piece of paper. They were Polaroids of these women that he had taken advantage of in compromising situations. So Harlan was not the folk hero. If you read the Sentinel from those days, they almost built him up as this, he gets away with it again, but he wasn't a good guy. But he was very effective in organizing his structure of power here in Central Florida. And so he kind of, it fanned out, and he kind of cut the area into all these different sub-regions. We had Cecil Merritt, who ran the East Altamont and a lot of the black communities in Sanford area. And we had, Ralph Strauder up in Volusia County. He separated out into this. And quick side note before I move on is somebody whose name is not on this sheet, whose name I will not mention out of respect for them. But as I was doing my research, I came across a very familiar last name of somebody who's involved in some historic organizations with me. So I went to this guy and I said, do you know him? Like, his last name was kind of peculiar, a little bit peculiar. And he's like, oh yeah, that's Uncle Cecil. And he said, he's a great guy. I had great memory. I'm like, did you know? So it's just funny that the connection is still so close and so close in the memories. But he had very positive memories of his Uncle Cecil, and Cecil did spend some time in prison, but apparently after that got his life together and kind of left the organization. So it's not this Cecil Merritt, but it was a different Cecil. But anyway, just saying, like, it's not so distant from where we are today. All right, let's talk about Clyde Lee. So Clyde Lee here in the middle of this, if you can see the names on this sheet, and you see he was the underboss who controlled Longwood, Orlando. This was the most prominent underboss that Harlan had. It was his most trusted confidant in the area. They knew each other for decades, and he trusted him with his life. So as I mentioned, for over 20 years, they knew each other. He operated the largest racket that he had, and one thing that you should kind of frame the personality in your mind, Clyde Lee was a reckless, in-your-face mafioso. Like, he did not care. Everybody knew who he was, and he almost wanted you to know. There's countless stories in newspapers of, like, high-speed police chases that he'd lead people on. Like, he was that reckless mob person that you think about in the movies. Another associate of Harlan Blackburn was Fat Sam Cagnina. So Clyde, was an Italian. You can probably tell from his name. Fat Sam was your big brawny Italian. Again, framing the personality of Sam in your mind, he was this guy who built himself up. He liked to brag about stuff that probably wasn't really true. Like, all of he was basically told fish tales. Everything he did became bigger and bigger than it actually was. He knew the Traficantes, but when he told it he was a nephew, he was just that guy. But he was never as good as he made you think he was. So Fat Sam, Harlan, and Clyde were on a little run one day. And Harlan said, hey, I got to go inside and take care of some business. Why don't you hang out here with Fat Sam? And while Harlan was inside, Fat Sam pulled out a gun. And Clyde saw this coming and tried to drive away as fast as he can. A few bullets were thrown his way, but Clyde was able to get away. Assassination attempt on Clyde's life there. Now, you would think that would be pretty obvious to Clyde that Harlan had ordered that hit. But Harlan was pretty convincing and said, no, Clyde, I don't know why Fat Sam did this. and convinced them that, hey, we're still friends, we're still cool, we're, nothing going on here. So they stayed in business together. I think I said that was in March. Later that year, things changed a little bit more. So this is Longwood. So if you see, this is I-4 and 434, where you see that little house icon off of Douglas, if you know that area, is where where Clyde Lee lived. And where you see that little gas station there was a place that Clyde would frequent. And so he would go there all the time, pick up his newspaper. He knew all the people who worked in the gas station there. And there was a payphone out by this gas station. And one of the things they would, in their code, that they would say, hey, call me from the glass house. And call me from the glass house meant that Clyde Lee would go to the payphone and he'd call Harlan basically to get his orders. So one morning Harlan said, meet me, call me from the glass house at a certain time in the morning. And so he did. So Clyde was making the call on the phone with Harlan. When the car pulls up, 4 people jump out of the car, one of those being Fat Sam, and they fire all these rounds at him, right? The glass is shattered in the phone booth. Clyde Lee is shot 4 times. The car speeds off, leaving Clyde for dead. Only Clyde did not die. So assassination attempt number 2 that was failed by our very competent hitman, Sam Cagnina, right? However, when this went to court, Fat Sam was found not guilty. The witnesses, seeing 4 different people out there, it was kind of the crack of morning, it was a little bit dark. The witnesses' stories did not quite align with each other, and Fat Sam got off with that second failed murder attempt. However, Harlan himself was not quite as lucky, because when this went to court, despite Fat Sam's not guilty, Harlan was found guilty of conspiracy to murder, and he went away to prison. Now, he got out a few times here and there, and every time that he'd get out of prison on parole or whatever, he'd find himself right back in the drug business or whatever business, always some sort of racket, and he would wind up right back in prison. He died in the early 90s in a prison in Minnesota. But effectively, after the mid-70s, Harlan, even though he tried to still control power from the prison cell, his reign was effectively over. So Harlan finally got his due. Before I move on to the complicity of the sheriff's departments, I did want to point out one other mobster, and I was talking to somebody right before the show about this guy, and I didn't really have a lot about them because it wasn't Booze and Bolita, it was more the drug game, but I wanted to mention the Dixie Mafia, just because it's just another notorious case here. So besides Harlan's Booze and Bolita rackets, and Harlan was involved in drugs too, but the Dixie Mafia was another prominent power in the 60s and 70s here in Central Florida, and its leader was Errol Resnick. And Errol Resnick had a business in downtown Orlando, a thrift and gun shop. He was also involved in the coin trade, melted down some coins for gold, which was illegal at that time. But he was also very famously a drug runner. So one time he took a plane, he hired a pilot to take him down to a desolate landing strip in Jamaica. Supposedly the pilot had no idea what they were doing, he was just hired as a charter pilot. And the pilot saw some things, noticed some things that maybe he wasn't supposed to notice. And so when he got back to Florida, that pilot went to the authorities and said, hey, I just made this run with this guy. I think something shady is going on. And they brought Errol up on charges, and the prime witness was this pilot. The pilot never made it to the trial. They found his body buried near Sorrento. He had been shot multiple times. He had been forced to drink Drano, and then his body was covered in lye. So they were making a statement, but they had enough evidence. They actually did convict Errol, not that he did this personally, but that he had ordered that hit, and he was sentenced to death and spent the rest of his life in prison. That was Errol Resnick. And that wasn't his only murder, by the way, so convicted of multiple murders. So, yeah. All right, this is a very short part of it. I just wanted to kind of talk about kind of the complicity of the law enforcement and the politicians. This went up every single level. And again, none of what we talked about today, all this could have been stopped at any time. They could have put an end to this. But because the money from these mobs swayed elections, and because the bribe money found their way into pockets of sheriffs, officers, governors, they did nothing about it. There's countless cases of these mayors and sheriffs that got ungodly rich that was in no way justified by the meager salary they had from their sheriff job. And there's only one way that those things happen. Sheriff Frank Williams in Polk County, as I talked about him a little bit earlier, he was actually found guilty of these charges and removed from office after a lot of the mafiosos in Polk County turned against him, including Ed Milan. So he was one example. He essentially, once he took power, he controlled the bosses. So in many ways, I think about the sheriffs in the areas, in some cases, being the boss. He would turn on and off operations at will. When the heat got too hot from the press, he would tell them to stop, and they'd stop. He set terms of demanding a 5% cut of all their sales. So these guys effectively were the extorters of the extorters, if you think about it. In Seminole County, there's also been multiple cases of similar sheriffs being complicit. And in this case, Ashton Merrow, he wasn't really involved, but he looked the other way. And the reason he looked the other way is because he was put into power on the back of Condor Merritt. Now, if you don't know Condor Merritt, he was essentially the boss of East Altamont Springs in that community, and is actually well regarded in that community despite some of these ties to Bolita. But Sheriff Ashton Merrow had lost every single precinct in Seminole County. Now, it was a close election. It wasn't a blowout, but it was close. But he had lost every single precinct until you got to East Altamont, where the victory in his favor was phenomenal, and that put him over the top and put him in office. So he was quite literally put into office by Condor Merritt, and consequently, again, looked the other way to those operations. Now, this went all the way up to the governor's offices, and this is not the only governor. It's the only example I have here. I could certainly give you more, but the governor's races were swayed by this, and the governor's pockets were padded by this. And I didn't talk about Ignacio Antinori, but he was another guy in Tampa before the Traficantes, and he was a frequent. The governor was a frequent house guest of this mafia leader. So anyway. That's all I have for you guys today, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Byrne. Any questions?
Hi, two quick questions. On one of those organization charts, I saw 3 women's names, so I was wondering how involved women were in the rackets, number one, and number two, this is all history. What's going on today?
Yeah, I would say that women were definitely very involved, and they generally were not the boss. They usually weren't the kind of lieutenants that you see in the second or actually third tier there, but they definitely were filling some of those other positions. They could be the runners of dropping things off. They could be the peddlers. They were definitely involved. I believe her name was, I'm going to botch it, Lexi Belch. I believe her name was Clyde Lee's girlfriend, was definitely heavily involved in all of his operations. And the second one, today, I mean, who knows, right? If I knew, I wouldn't say. But I don't think there's not any really pronounced mafia leaders that are well known. Back in these days, these people weren't a secret, right? Like, you knew who they were. So if there is some of this element going on today, it's certainly not to the scale it was in those days, and it's certainly maybe under the behind the scenes. There's a lot of people. There's Facebook groups that I'm a part of called the Tampa Mafia, and a lot of the descendants of all these mafiosos are now there, and they talk about kind of the good old days and things like that. But arguably the politicians are the mafia bosses now, so.